What is going on, everybody? And in this video, we're providing you a state of the market and stock picks for April 5th, 2023. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, consider subscribing as I do provide daily and weekly updates to get you prepared for the day and a week ahead in this glorious market. So, actually got some selling today, which was quite interesting. Actually, we opened up the day with the market wanting to essentially rip. We did have some news today. We had the JOLTS report, and things are actually starting to reflect a lot of the bad stuff that we've been talking about for months. This delayed reaction is starting to become the new reality. And not only that, we are starting to see a lot of huge dives in the housing market, just around the median home sale prices around the US. And those numbers will they're projecting essentially the next or this month, by the end of this month, that we're going to go negative year over year on growth, and understand that that hasn't happened in a very long time. And if that happens, that plays into loans. And understand that even though to get a loan right now, you have to become not only extremely qualified, but it's going to be even tougher once that happens. And so, again, right now, again, the banks are really, really eerily quiet. Aside from big old Trump news, I mean, there isn't really much else news out there. We are waiting for core, and we are waiting for essentially bank earnings next week. JPM, however, has made comments that about a potentially recession and things like that, uh, stating the obvious, right? And the banks, to be honest, the bank CEOs have pretty been open about how they feel about. There was a point last year in which they said that we were going to have a soft landing. Then they kind of changed, and ever since then, they've kind of been stating the facts, right? At the beginning of this year, they said that was the top of the market, right? When we pumped towards the back half of last year into this year, which is normally one of the strongest rallies that we do have in a normal cycle. So coming into this year, they said that that was a top, and essentially since then we've been kind of just selling. So we haven't really done a lot, but yet we are. There's claims that we are in a new bull market, and I pointed that out yesterday. The charts aren't any different. We aren't in any bull market. The problem is we have a lot of delayed data. We have massive layoffs that are continuing to happen, and now a lot of that data is starting to come be realized. And so today, like even today, like there really wasn't a lot of news, yet we were selling, right? Like technical wise, we have hit that zone. I said yesterday we are in a zone that we're going to start selling. We started to sell. Question is, do we continue to sell? We do have a short week, so you have to keep that in mind too. And being said, if it is a short week, normally the market is easier to be thrown around because there's not a lot of volume. And then you look into a full week next week, we could potentially get a correction on whatever that is. But ultimately, things aren't in a good state, and they're continuing to get worse. The Fed themselves are potentially going to start going negative on essentially what they make in their yearly profits. A good chunk of that goes to the treasury, and aside from that, they keep whatever. But understand that it's been like over 100 years since they've been negative, and they're looking at being negative 100 billion this year. And so which again hasn't happened in like 100 years, and they're projecting to be negative for the next 3 years. And so we are in a very delicate state, and to think that we're not, and think that we're just going to head up and pivot. The market may be trying to price in a pivot, but that can't happen, right? You need something bigger and badder to happen. And one thing to keep in, like one thing I keep stating as well, is the move isn't going to come until they start pricing in a recession, which typically happens when something breaks. Again, right now, everything you continue to hear, nothing but soft landings, sound and resilient. Again, as soon as they say that we are in or the realization that we are actually in a recession or potentially a depression, is when we start selling off heavily. And I'm feeling that time is going to come. A lot of the reflected numbers are going to start exposing as we're starting to see, as today in the JOLTS numbers and some of the other things that we're going to start getting up going into May and then no, or until June, that things are going to get really bad, and that at that point we should have a good solid flush, which we could essentially quote unquote claim as a bottom, potentially, right? It all depends on how everything happens. Now they're saying we could pull out of this. I'm not really seeing how we could. There's still massive layoffs, even though we're in tech. McDonald's has, they're trying to lay off tons of people as well. Those numbers still haven't come out. Of what I've heard yesterday, we heard that a bunch of the bigger higher executives were essentially sent home and then let go today, from what I've heard. Now, that's not to mention all the other potential layoffs that might be coming, right? They're expected to be laying off a ton. And so, with all that being said, it's not just affecting tech. Tech has had absolutely massive, massive layoffs. And so I know Amazon themselves have laid off like 20,000 people. Now, understand that, yes, during the pandemic and ramping up, they hired a lot of people coming back. But again, this leads into many other problems and all the problems that we talk about, right? And understand that since the pandemic, a lot of people don't want to go back to work. A lot of people are remote. So a lot of these buildings that they're having to rent, right? The owners of these commercial buildings are defaulting because they don't have anybody to come rent the buildings anymore. And so you're seeing massive defaults happen out in California and all over as far as commercial real estate. So it is again a very interesting subject, and understand that things are starting to cascade and the real true data is starting to come out. Right. And this is why I do have a thesis in the reality versus what is perceived or what is painted by the utopian picture by the administration and the Fed and everybody. Again, not trying to draw panic, but you can only do it for so long before reality does hit the wire. And then that reality takes a hold of the current market and just slams it into the dirt. So, and again, we have a lot of different things. Like I said, they weren't expecting the OPEC stuff to happen. Again, could lead to high inflation. They weren't expecting that. You get random things that pop up. We weren't expecting a bank crisis this early, and it already happened. And then we continue to increase rates by 25 point basis move. Not to mention what is still coming, right? They're still expecting another 25 point basis move here in June. Again, if something breaks, something bigger happens, right? We're trying to get some kind of deflationary event that's going to cause Powell to say, okay, well, I got to start cutting rates, and it has to be big, it has to be bad, and we just haven't had that. Yeah, we've had some events, and it's really, really nasty, but it's not a big event. It's not big enough to be like, okay, well, maybe we need to stop. That hasn't happened yet. And so, even though we've lost two of the biggest banks, two of the most historical biggest losses in banks over the past 2 weeks, and all of a sudden we haven't had anything. And so, again, if you think the market is just going to continue up because they're pumping money into as a backstop, the backstops historically haven't worked. The first backstop hasn't worked. So, with that being said, again, not trying to draw panic, I'm not trying to fearmonger. That's just not what I do. I'm just pointing out what I'm seeing and the obvious facts that are out there. But again, the biggest thing here is that we are aiming for core next week. We are aiming for banks next week. We want to see what happens and what exposure we can get there, and how bad these companies are. Again, Tesla just came out with delivery numbers, and they were lower than expected, even with the cuts. And so, even with the cuts in the credits, Tesla is still doing phenomenal. To be honest, going through the pandemic and everything, like Tesla is like the best company, right? Like they've shown that they can still produce ridiculous numbers. Even since this time last year, they still had well over 100,000 more cars produced than they did last year. So overall, as an individual company, they're doing great, but ultimately understand all the stuff they had to overcome just to get to where they are is just absolutely absurd. And they're showing a lot of weakness. And so we have to keep this in mind and understand that, again, this thing that will play out at some point. Not saying don't take advantage of the pumps. I called out a couple stocks the other day that were that looked prime to try to take advantage of the pump, that being snow and that being Home Depot. They pumped well over the past 2 days, and then you had Cat and John Deere absolutely tank today, and then the banks just start selling off like crazy, and so that started leading the downfall of this red candle today. And so again, there's not really going to be a lot. Like I said, we'll get more. We'll get non-farms. I'm assuming that still comes out on Friday, even though the market is closed. Maybe that's a good thing. Who knows? Maybe those numbers will purposely be released like that because maybe they're so bad that maybe the realistic numbers will show on Friday, and then maybe we gap down into Monday. That could be a strong possibility, right? And then leading into the next core and leading into banks, and the core hopefully is continuing to come down. That's a big concern now with the oil. You're not going to see the oil numbers or that inflation on this report anyway. You'll see it on the next report. Again, it's too close to this report to really see any kind of significance, but you will definitely see it on the next report. So that's what I'm talking about, delayed data, is it takes a while for this data to really play out. So with that being said, currently what we have is potentially some more selling, at least selling down to the 4K mark is kind of what I'm looking at. So you're looking at support here. We took these studies off, actually. It's a little bit harder to see with these studies on, but that's what I'm kind of looking, 50% retracement, at least the 4K mark. That would at least sell off into earnings and then potentially push up. That would give us kind of more of an earnings run, a second dig at earnings again. But we'll have to see. And again, if earnings are bad, it might just be the catalyst to sell us back down to the 3,800. And then maybe potentially something will break by the time earnings is over. It's kind of what I'm thinking, at least until big tech, right? Once big tech is done with earnings, like I've always stated before, earnings is pretty much done at that point. So kind of towards the end of April, maybe May might have some big tech in it. I haven't really looked at the schedule, but no, Tesla's like the back half of April. And so any other big tech, as soon as that is done, once your Amazons and Apples have all reported, Microsoft, then at that point, essentially earnings are done on my mind. Like the market will make its decision after that. We may run another week after that to try to take advantage of things that were really good or really bad, whatever the case is. And then after that, we correct and we just start heading down or up, whatever the direction is. So again, we don't have a big enough catalyst to continue up because people are well aware that we have not pivoted yet. So there's no reason to really rip. So for SPX, we are looking for a breakout roughly over the 4140. Like I said, it's been a hard ceiling. We got rejected once. We'll see if we reattempt tomorrow or if we break below this 4088 mark tomorrow and start selling off to the 4K mark. Again, you do have some support. We got speed bumps at the 255. You got another speed bump at the 206. And then you have that 4K mark. So kind of watching that tomorrow towards the back half of the week. Again, I think normally you see some selling before you actually go into earnings. So this could potentially be our selling window until we go into earnings and then potentially pump back and retest this 4120 mark. So I have to see how that does play out. Bitcoin again going sideways, waiting for news. Right, all the markets are essentially waiting for news. Most of them are. The banks have been pretty much holding, but Bitcoin itself, again, there's a lot of skepticism about what could potentially coming up. About the SEC and trying to shut down crypto. You have to understand it could take is for them to come out and say that America, you can't buy crypto anymore. And then that would essentially, I think, be the gut shot to drop this thing. Much like China did, like China stopped people from buying crypto multiple different times. And then they let them buy it again. So I think we could potentially have something like that where they say the U.S. can't buy crypto, and then and then it just tank it, and then from that point, then it could potentially pick back up, maybe months down the road or a couple of years down the road, who knows? But just again, potential. Got to think of the different options that could potentially play out there, and what could come from that. So with that being said, we'll see what happens. Right now, it's trading sideways, and the longer it stays in this consolidation mode, the bigger the move is going to be out of here. So whether that decouples or whether it starts selling heavily back down, Again, on the monthly, this does not look good at all. On the monthly, this looks like a dead cat bounce. This is what a dead cat bounce looks like. You have massive selling, and then you get a medium bounce, and then you continue to sell, and then you come down here and start consolidating. So roughly around that 10K mark could be a strong possibility until the next halving, or we get closer to the next halving. We have to let this bigger catalyst play out. Is what I'm getting to. And so for people to think that we're just going to reverse or whatever the case is, yes, we reverse. Once we start selling, then you price in a recession, right? And when you price in a recession, that's when the major selling starts coming. And the big crash that I talk about or I reference that could potentially happen is when you start pricing in a recession. But the problem is, again, we will paint a pretty picture until we start getting realistic numbers of what's really happening, which takes a long time to play out, as we're seeing. And then when they start playing out, then that's when the market's like, oh crap, well, I got to price this in. And so it starts selling off heavily then. So dollar won't really go over that. I just want to mention, though, for the whole BRICS thing and the controversy around that, not really concerned about that. My biggest thing would be that essentially the next presidential candidate, again, I'm not trying to be political here, but we're going to need someone that's going to come in and start putting more focus on BRICS and trying to break that up. Ultimately, though, you have to understand that China and Russia, a lot of people are leaving those countries. Those countries are all very, very corrupt. And so people aren't just going to ditch the dollar for corrupt countries. So that being said, we will see what happens. But that's where I stand as far as the dollar, where it goes from there. Again, right now, since we have the banking crisis, the dollar is going to go everywhere. It really doesn't matter at this point because the market's in the final stage. Like once we get to the final stage, we don't really care what happens to the dollar at that point. So, and then Tesla actually got some selling again monthly. It looks like we retested this monthly and started selling. So looking for potentially a new low here. We want a new low. We definitely have to break below the 100, but I do like the way this looks on the monthly. On the retest, rejection, if this continues to start selling heavy, it's kind of what I'm watching on everything, watching it on Bitcoin, watching it on Tesla. Again, if all industries start looking the same, that is a bad sign. That means a big move is about ready to happen. But we'll see what happens there. I can actually flip this back to the daily. But we started to get some selling today. We'll see if we can get back down to 177 tomorrow. Bulls, you definitely want to keep this over 198. 199 essentially, but again, you get a very hard ceiling of the 220. So I expect this to at least drop down to the 178 and kind of prep for earnings and see what happens. Again, I'm not expecting a lot. I'm expecting some really bad stuff. Not to say it will completely sell, but we might just get more chop. I don't really expect us to go exploding out of here either. So we will see. But like I said, if something happens, we start seeing that we are in a recession, that things are really bad because we're starting to get some of that data now. And then we could get our final quote unquote crash move. And then that would be the final stage to say, okay, we can start laying off rates. And then at that point, then we could reverse. Again, trying to price, you can't price that in. That's just not going to happen, right? Because up to this point, everything was supposed to be a soft landing and nothing was going to happen. You can only play that story for so long before it doesn't actually work. So we'll see what's going on with there. BA again, still getting rejected here at the 220. Needs to break 220. Otherwise, it needs to hold 194. But again, it's holding the market up a lot as well. This whole just back and forth, it helps the market. Again, they do a tremendous amount of buybacks too, which is absolutely absurd. So that's definitely helps Boeing. Again, that's fully backed by the government. So they're not going to let Boeing go under. JPM again still needs to fill that gap, much like Boeing and Tesla. It's got a huge gap that needs to fill. So we'll see. JPM needs to hold roughly the 122. If it does break that, I think it will fill this gap down to the 108. Otherwise, it needs to break up over 135 for the bulls to really start coming back. Again, this is a lower low here. So, I mean, it doesn't even look like it has enough strength to pump up. That's potentially the problem. There's a lot of rumors going around about JPM too. Definitely not a good sign. That's one of our top banks. It's a critical bank that we can't let go under. So even if something did happen to it, you would definitely get a flurry of a lot of other banks going under because all focus would be on JPM. So but we'll wait and we'll see what happens with that. Aside from that, that's pretty much what I got. I don't want to make these videos too long. There's not a lot of new news. There's a lot of stuff going on behind the closed doors. Again, we're getting ready to go into earnings. And so kind of just prepping for that. Again, be wary. Any new event can come out and start really dictating the pace at which the sell-offs happen, or potential push up. Again, my probability is heavily weighted on the downside because of all the current situation in the market. It's not saying we can't pump, but I think our pumps will be very limited, and we're seeing that that they're we're playing a range, right? And we're at the top of the range, and so we'll sell back off. We'll get a lot of bad news, sell back to the lower range. Now the question is, when we start selling, do we get some of these black swans to start playing out, and then you can get more heavily sell side, and then we get some good news and we'll pump back to the top of the range, but it's not good enough to break us out because we haven't actually pivoted. Till we actually pivot, you're not going to break out of these top ranges and actually go back to all-time high. The market will be too afraid to put that much risk on, considering what is currently going on with the market. And then you got a bunch of new news with the OPEC bank crisis, and then BRICS. Not that I think it really matters, but nonetheless, we will see what happens in moving forward. So with that being said, go ahead and drop a like button, comment, let me know what you're looking at for tomorrow. And until next time, I'll see you guys later.